All right, Elliot. Thanks again for taking the time to meet with me. Everybody, once again, I want to emphasize this is raw, uncut. So if there's any mistakes or anything that we say, we'll probably just correct ourselves. I'm not the one to do a bunch of editing and whatnot because it's just not my expertise. But this is my good friend Elliot. I've known Elliot from back in the Denny Hecker days. So those of you who are from Minnesota may know who Denny Hecker was. He had about 18 dealerships back in the early 2000s up to maybe 2009. And that's where I met Elliot. Both just sold cars and kind of our trajectories once the company went out of business went different ways. And we were fortunate enough to reconnect about a year ago. And in getting to know him again over the past year, I've really, really enjoyed his passion for what he's doing right now. His passion to share it with others, to make this available to everybody. I just really, really love about it. So, without further ado, I want to introduce my good friend Elliot.
Hi, thanks for having me, Caesar.
Absolutely. I'll just give a little bit of background. Elliot has just recently, about a year ago, launched his own quality assurance company called Think Tank. He has it with two partners, one's out in California, one's here in Minnesota. But in a very, very short time, I would say about a year time frame, they've managed to grow the revenues into the seven figures. And so I'm just excited for what he's doing and want to, again, highlight his story for those of you who have maybe thought about it and maybe said, oh, I'm just too old or not, don't have any training in it or whatever that may be. I think you'll find Elliot's story pretty exciting. So again, I'll start. Let's go back all the way to the car business. We were with good old Denny Hecker, and as many of you may know, he had got into some legal trouble with Chrysler.
What?
Ended
I'm just
up,
hearing about this now. What?
right? Yeah, fun fact. He's actually out now.
Yeah, that's right.
um, and was essentially using their accounts kind of on his own. But more stories about 2009 was when the closed shop. Sound about
Yep,
right?
that sounds about right. Yeah.
And then right, so most like most of us, Elliot found himself without a job and maybe now without a career, and maybe just to
Mhm.
start from there and what you were doing at that
Sure.
point.
Well, that's I guess just a little pretext is that I had spent the previous, before I met you at Denny's, I had spent the previous 10, 15 years as a cook and a chef and a sous chef and sort of in the management structure of restaurants. And when I hit my early 30s, I started to realize that it was taking too big a toll on my body and too big a toll on my personal life. And I'd learned those lessons before and didn't want to relearn them. So I decided it was time to go. So I left a pretty decent, stable job in that business, and uh, I still needed to, pay the rent, keep the lights on. So I had grown up. My dad was in sales my whole life. He was a teacher once upon a time back in the 60s and 70s, but had transitioned into sales. So I grew up in a sales environment and sort of understood what that meant, and so it came somewhat naturally to me. And I had seen a ad for Denny because, of course, he was always hiring, always recruiting. Um,
He was good
there's
at that.
yeah, and there's reason for it too.
Yeah.
But I had seen an ad, and it was the base was enough to keep the lights on. So I figured, all right, well, maybe I'll make some bread and figure out what my next move is. So that's how I got into Denny, and yeah, so I was essentially career shifting at that point. I didn't quite know what the next step would be, but I knew that, change is an opportunity. So I figured I'd force myself into change and then look for the opportunities. Um, yeah, so I did, and I enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed the work. I like talking to people. I like cars. I like doing deals. I like closing deals. That was all very rewarding. So I kind of kept at it even after Denny. I wound up at a couple other dealerships outside of Denny's group. um, until let's see, until I had sort of come to the point where um, that was the Great Recession was on
Yeah,
full
it's coming.
time,
Yeah.
and the market was super soft, and it was real dog eat dog in the car business. I think Cash for Clunkers was my last big that was my last big
Nice.
set of deals came out of that. And that's boy, that somebody's got to write a book about that one day, because that that was something else. Um,
I'm
but
sure.
yeah, at that point, I kind of had to ask myself, all right, well, this obviously isn't long term. This isn't going to be the thing I do. I'm not going to be a GM at some store someplace, and that's
Yeah.
um, so what do I do now? Um, and I had actually at the time been sort of amusing myself on the side with uh, 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 working on a podcast.
Okay.
In all my life, for fun, I've been into computers, tech, and video gaming, right? That's just, I grew up in that. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and so, the original Atari, everything from Pong forward had my attention,
Yeah.
Um,
Cool.
and I had connected with a specific podcast, Priority One podcast, that had just been around for for 2 or 3 months. Had been it had primarily covered a specific science fiction game that I was really looking forward to and enjoying. And I got into it because they had to quit. They did 33 episodes, and they were like, "Hey, I just got a job with the company that makes this game. I can't, conflict of interest. I can't, their HR won't let me do it anymore. So, let us know if you want to take it over." So I called them up and said, "Oh, I'll do it. Sure, why not?" Um, and me and two other guys got into it, and at that point, I realized um, that I could use this because through the podcast, uh, I was able to connect with the engineering team behind the game,
Okay.
and because they wanted to talk about the work they were doing, and we had a platform. And so I realized uh, that I had an opportunity to network my way into a job in the games business.
Okay.
And so I pretty aggressively set out to do that, because it had always seemed like when you imagine being a rock star or an NFL pro, right? Like it's
Yeah.
one of those things like, God, I'd love to do that, but it's not in the cards, right? Who gets to do that? One in a million.
Yeah.
And for me, that's what working in the video games industry felt like, right? It felt like, getting called up to the majors or something like that,
Right.
right? Like
Okay.
like it was an opportunity to get my foot in a door that otherwise I would have been a million miles away from me. Um, so like I say, I sort of aggressively started leveraging those podcast connections in order to make the best show in that genre I could, so that I could show that, hey, I can accomplish some things even with zero budget.
Okay.
Um, and then also get to know those people so that they knew me on a personal level. So if there were an opportunity, they'd feel inclined to share it with me.
Okay.
Um, and I wound up talking to their director, um, and he said, "Geez, I've got this job, and I'd love to hire you for it, but you don't have the education for it, and you don't have the experience for it, so it's going to be awfully hard to get you past HR. I'll tell you what, though, if you go just get an entry level software quality assurance job somewhere, get that stamp on your resume, then I can get you in, and we'll go from there." Uh, I didn't want to do quality assurance. I wanted to do project management, essentially.
Okay.
I wanted to produce the games and get them from A to B, because I'm pretty good at making things happen. So I knew that then. Um,
And
and
is that
so
is
yeah,
that from the restaurant business? Like you could manage a project moving forward. Is that
yeah,
just managing people?
high end, middle to high end scratch kitchens is where I did most of my work, and that's a very complex job.
Okay.
It's labor, it's budget, it's perishable inventory. 6 figures of perishable inventory you've got to manage all the time. Not to mention process and training and the personnel management required in order to get a group of people that range from culinary students and graduates to ex-cons. So I mean, you've got to get all those people
Yeah. Okay.
working hand in hand in a precise fashion in order to deliver on the razor thin margins that keep you in business. And
Yeah.
so
That's
I knew
impressive.
so I knew I could do a thing or two.
Okay.
Um, and I figured that somehow those skills would translate and I'd make it happen. Uh, and uh, so I did that. So I found out from uh, a person I went to school with who was interning at Activision Software, Activision Games, that they had an office locally and that they routinely hired about 200 QA testers at a time and then fired them 9 months later and then rehired them 3 months after that and
Yeah.
on, right?
Yep.
And so I figured, well, I'll give it a shot. Um, and so I went to interview, and it was a cattle call. It was absolutely a cattle call. There were 200 kids there. I was by far the oldest person in the building. I think I was 32 or 35, something like that.
Yeah.
And everybody else was, 18 to 24, at most.
Okay.
Uh, and the people I were interviewing with were, with the exception of one, the director of the entire department, were all younger than I was, and it wasn't really a big deal for me. That, but it was,
There was a means to an end, right?
yeah,
You needed to get that stamp, like
I
you
needed
said.
to get that stamp, and I was going to do whatever it took to get it.
Yep.
And luckily, and so here's where, um, uh, I had an ace in the hole, and that's that I'm married. Um, I was 30 something and I was married, and my wife had a stable job at the time, and I said I want to try this, and she said, well, I'll give you a year. I'll cover the bases and keep us out of hot water for a year. But if you can't make it work in that time, then you better figure something else out.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, all right, great, I can do that. If it hadn't been for my wife, none of this would be happening right now. Period.
It's
Just
awesome. That's
none
that's
of
a,
it.
that's a really cool
I
testimony. I wanted to touch on that too, how you guys work together, and when there's times where she carried you and maybe you
Yep.
carried her, and so that's awesome.
Yep. Yeah, I've been able to repay that kindness a couple of times over, and she also. So I mean, I can't stress enough how important that uh
Team.
the practical relationship of marriage. I mean, never mind the fact that I love her and we have a wonderful time, and and all that, but the actual practical purpose of marriage, how big a deal that was for me. That none of this would be possible without that support, because I didn't come from money and resources. I didn't.
Yeah.
I've got all the privilege that a middle-aged white guy has. That's true. I've leveraged it consciously. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
you got to be kind of dumb to not leverage every advantage you've got, and
Yeah.
I knew that was an advantage I carried, so I used it along the way. But uh, but that the advantage of having a partner who was willing to put some skin in the game, that's the one that put it over the top.
Good.
Um, so
Good.
yeah, so I interviewed with Activision, um, and they were very skeptical. The team I interviewed with, they were like, "So what are you even doing here? Like what, like you could read that, are you like
Yeah.
are you a plant from corporate to try to catch us at something? Like there was a lot of skepticism, and so it was looking like it wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't really planning on mentioning the podcast. But then one of their questions was, so you got to just tell us, why do you want to do this at this stage in life? And so I told them the story I just told you, essentially,
Yeah.
and showed them the podcast and said, this is a passion. This is proof that it's a passion for me, and that's why you need to believe me when I say I'm going to do whatever it takes in order to succeed at this, because that's what it takes. And they said, are you aware that we pay $9 an hour? And I said, I,
Wow.
I said no.
But okay.
but, but I wasn't aware of that. But like I said, I'm not doing this for the money.
Yeah.
That'll come later. So so my wife Carrie was making an investment in me, and I was making an investment in me, and saying that if I do this for a year, it's going to pay off in ways that I can't calculate right now, and so I'm going to take this hit and make it happen. And so then I got a call back and they said, yeah, come on down. And for 9 months or so, as a contractor, I did game testing for anywhere from 8 to 12 hours a day,
Wow.
6 to 7 days a week, because they just, boy, it was a lot of work.
You
It
hit
was,
you hit that overtime at least at
yeah,
1350, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
there were days when we were at, in what's called crunch time, and for your non-tech folks, that's essentially a period where you're approaching release of a piece of software, and all hands on deck, you know, in order to get it across the finish line. And there were times during crunch time where they would have us in two shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So I'd work 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I'd get up, my chair would spin once, and the 7 p.m. guy would sit down in it and pick up the controller or the keyboard and pick up where I left off, and on we went. And that would go on for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, so that poor chair
Wow.
was sitting there, uh, never cooled down for 3 months. Um, yeah, people were sleeping on couches and living off bagels and crappy coffee,
Cream
and
cheese.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It was something else, but I don't
Yeah.
regret it for a minute. I would absolutely do it again. I enjoyed the work. The actual
Yeah.
work of it was really fulfilling for me, and I really liked it. And I was
Cool.
good at it, which was reassuring, because you don't know when you're taking a
Yeah.
risk like that. You don't
It's
know
a
if
passion. It's a passion, right?
it's a
So you
passion, but maybe I suck at it.
yeah, yeah, true. Yep. So you get your stamp, you worked 9 months, and you were a contractor, right? So your time was up.
Yep.
What happens then?
Well, being a 30 something in a environment of 20 somethings, it was pretty easy to stand out.
Okay.
And so real quickly, I bonded with my direct supervisor, and he realized the value that I was bringing to the table, the reliability, the predictability, the
Mm,
work ethic, the things like that that you develop throughout your 20s, and
right.
put a fine point on in your 30s. He was glad for that. And we liked each other generally,
All right.
and so he,
You
at the end of
continue
my,
to you
yeah,
continue to network yourself into the right
absolutely.
spots.
Did not
Okay.
slow down. And at the end of that contract, he said, "Well, obviously, I'd have you back. I'd love to have you back, but listen, I know a guy who's the director of quality assurance over at this company called the Nerdery. Now, it's not in the games business, but it is in the software business. And you're good at this, and I like you, and I trust you. And he sometimes picks up some of our contractors when their contracts are over. Would you be interested in that?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "They pay grown up money." And I said, "Tell me
Okay.
more." Yeah. Yes, I would like to hear about
Yeah.
that. And so he made a call for me, and I went over and I interviewed. Um, that was terrifying, because I had just gotten my head around, one of the great things about working at Activision was that I got a crash course, of very much a boot camp, because it was long hours, it was hard work, it was, just constant, battling all the
Work.
elements
Yeah.
of it. And but I got a boot camp style education on software development. I learned who does what. I learned why they do it. I learned why it's hard for them to do it sometimes. I learned how I can support them in doing that, and I learned really kind of the broad strokes of how to do this job. Um, and that's something that you really don't get in school. If you go for a computer science degree, they don't teach you that. They teach you
Right.
computer science. You know,
Yeah.
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 Not white knuckled production. They don't.
Yeah.
um, and so uh you know I recognize that, because my restaurant career, white knuckle production is what it's all about, and I sort of recognize some of the crossover here. And so I went to interview, and I was very nervous, because it's a it's a big company locally, who uh
Mhm.
a lot of people with a lot of more education and experience than I did wanted to be working at.
Yeah.
And they
And
were
they were
talking,
growing fast at that
and they
point.
they were growing very fast and talking
Yeah.
about big money, and they had big clients, and so I felt really out of my depth,
Yeah.
walking in there. Um, and so I put a new resume together for it, and I put all of my various technical, because I'd done a few other things throughout the years. I used to climb poles for the telephone company for a year and a half, and I did a low voltage home security installations back in my early 20s for a year and a
Oh,
half, or that kind of thing,
okay.
and so I put all of that stuff at the top of my resume, and I buried all my restaurant experience because I figured there's no, that's not going to help me, but I should put it on
Yeah.
there so they know I haven't been just living in a
You've had a
basement
previous
for
job.
20
Yeah.
years. Um, but so I sat down in the interview, and the director, he was very, very intense kind of guy. Um, uh, uh, and he was flipping through my resume, asking me these questions, and went right to the back pages. And I was like, oh crap, this is over. All right, well, good experience, interview experience, right,
Good
right.
interview experience.
Yeah. And he's looking at it, and he's 5 pages in, and because this is back when a 5-page resume made sense, and
Uh,
and and he's looking at it, and he goes, God, I'll tell you what, Elliot, I'd love to hire you, but I've got, people who with years more experience than you applying for this job, because I was applying for an entry level QA engineer job. And he said, I can't hire you for that job. You don't have the experience for it. And I said, oh, I get it. I understand. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I'll do another 9 months at Activision, and then maybe,
yeah.
or I'll try with my California game developer buddies and see if there's something I can make happen there. And he paused and was quiet, and he looked up at me and said, but what I don't have lined up at the door is people with more than a decade of management experience. Would you be interested in running the department? Yes,
Long
yes,
pause, right?
yes, sir. Yes, sir, I would. Let's talk more about that. And so he brought in the other manager that I'd be working with, and we started talking, and an hour and a half later, the three of us were sort of riffing on ideas, and it was a done deal. And he said, I'll get an offer letter to you by tomorrow. And so it happened. I went from contract $9 an hour QA tester at Activision to a middle manager at this massive, quickly growing software company, in the space of 9 months. And at that point, I was just holding on for dear life. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna be drinking from a fire hose for a while. So I just braced for it, and
Yeah.
went with it. And it was wildly successful for me. It was a
Awesome.
really great experience.
And then I know you mentioned you got to manage people and you got to grow in nerdery, and like you said, like many people, it must have been a really tough year. I don't want to say fake it till you make it, but I'm sure in the process of drinking from a water hose, you're
Yeah.
learning a lot really fast,
Yep.
and you're adapting. And there's days where you go home and you're like, "What just happened?" And
Yep.
there's days where you feel successful. So
Yeah.
you navigated all that. Your time in nerdery came to an end, and you went to Samsung, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Or
So
go ahead.
yeah, so a couple, two or three of my employees had left over that time, because I was at the nerdery for almost 5 years.
Okay.
And during that time, a couple of my employees had left and gone to this company called Smart Things, which is a local company that wound up getting bought by Samsung.
Okay.
Um, and the nerdery had gone through a series of layoffs, and my job classification was caught up in that.
Oh,
Um, and so I had a decent severance, and I had, it had been 4 or 5 years of pretty good success. So I had stacked up a little, and I was in a good place to get laid off. Uh,
good, good.
so I was trying to figure out what the next step was, and the nerdery. This actually kind of ties into my current business, because the nerdery is a place that focuses on client work, on billable hours, doing contract engineering for clients. And
Okay.
so I had seen the way they'd done business, and I had seen the way they handled software quality assurance sales, and thought I could probably improve on that with some different ideas. And so I kind of tucked those away, and I thought, this will be for later.
Okay.
But right now, I still, at that point, my parents were still alive, and I was caring for them, and I had a teenager, and so there was, some financial pressures
Obviously.
that I needed to answer for.
Yep.
And so I needed the income, I needed the stability, I needed the health insurance.
Yep.
um and so one of my former employees who had gone to Samsung SmartThings, I guess they were putting together a new quality assurance team there, and the vice president for that division within SmartThings had asked, some of her engineers, and said, I'm having a hard time finding a manager for this team. Do you know anybody? And this former employee who was working there said, yeah, I do. I know a guy. He's the manager I want to work with again. So, give him a call. And so she did. And again, it's another interview process, and I was very forthright about my experiences that I thought were valuable, and where I thought I had weaknesses, because I didn't want to get into this massive global corporation on false pretenses.
Okay. Yep.
So I was very clear about, what my experience had been, and where, what value I thought I could bring to the table, and where I'd need help. And her response was essentially the same as the director of QA from the nerdery, which is that, I've got people for the engineering. I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is the people. I need to make sure they're happy, and that they're supported in a way they haven't been. I think you can do that, so you're hired. You know.
Nice. You got it.
um, yeah. Now this job was um, much more engineering heavy than the last one. The last one, I was really very much at the nerdery. I was very much a personnel manager,
Okay.
which bled into some project management. I was responsible for resourcing and project budgets to a degree, like to the degree that QA impacted those project budgets. Um, and so, I would often get pulled into project meetings to answer one question or another, or speak to an issue or something like that, and occasionally face to face with clients. Whereas at Samsung, there was also an expectation that I'd contribute to the planning, to the engineering, to planning on the engineering level in these projects, and that was new for me. Um, so I had enough experience that I was able to do that. Um, uh, but that was kind of my biggest concern at the outset, was that how am I going to build a team and build a department and do all this hiring and start, and build processes and everything else, while also drinking from yet another fire hose on the engineering level, and figuring out how to make that happen within this company also. Um, but I built a good team. I built a good team that supported me through that, and I supported them. And we wound up with a department that was, multiples of its original size when I took it over. Wound up having, I think, three different managers within the team. It was so large,
Oh.
um, and it was a really great experience, and I learned a lot about how a mega corporation works, how one of these international software
Yep.
giants does
Yep.
business. And that was extremely valuable. Again, that's not an education you can pay for. You have to earn it.
Yep. And then, if I recall correctly, Samsung then goes and decides, hey, we want to bring all of this work back to home base, right?
Mhm. Yep.
And
Yep,
once
for
again,
several reasons, there were layoffs. My team was caught up in that, so everybody in the team, from the VP to the newest hire, was out by the time it wrapped up. Um, and uh, but again, it had been another, 3, 4, going
yeah,
on 5 years, and I had learned a lot. Now all of a sudden, I turned around and I was like, wow, I've been doing this for more than 10 years now.
yeah,
And I've had some remarkable success during that time. I went from $9 an hour to six figures, plus bonuses and whatever. And you know, w- what's next?
hmm
Is it more of this? Is it, do I, uh, and I know it's probably considered gauche these days, but I had a money figure in my head, you know.
Yeah.
At each step of the way, I was like, all right, well, now that I know that the scale starts at $9 an hour, where do I set my sights along the way? What are achievable goals for the next 5 years and the 5 years after that? And I hit those,
Yeah.
and I hit them early every time. And so by this point, I had hit 3 or 4 of those what previously would have seemed,
Milestones.
yeah, they would have seemed unachievable prior
Okay.
to getting into this, and all of a sudden here I am achieving them early, every time, and without missing. And so I thought to myself, all right, well, let's get a little aggressive. What's next? You know, what's
All right.
and
So you have the experience with nerdery, you have experience with QA now in a large corporation like Samsung.
mhm.
And as you mentioned, I remember you telling me the story, this whole team got laid off here in the US. So you know a lot of engineers who are looking for work,
Yep,
right? So you think to
exactly.
yourself, what can I do with this newfound
Exactly.
knowledge and all of these people looking for work,
Yep. So for
right?
years, I had been planning in the back of my mind, just sort of in my little fantasy world about, well, if I were to do this, how would I do it? And
Mhm.
so I had some things on paper. I had a lot of ideas that were fairly mature by that point. And all of a sudden, I looked around and I saw, as you say, I saw this opportunity. I saw a bunch of engineers wondering what they were going to do on Monday, and a lot of them really enjoyed working with me and wanted to do it again. And so we started a alumni Slack, where people would help to network each other into new jobs and that kind of thing. And one of my former engineers from the nerdery, the one who got me the job essentially at Samsung Smart Things, had happened to mention in the group chat that, haha, we've got enough people here to start a company.
You're like, okay.
And so I messaged her because my thought was, A, I know who she is. I know her skills. I know that she doesn't quit. I know that she's never failed at anything, any task I've set her to. This is the kind of person I need behind me if we're going to make this happen. I need somebody I can count on, and I know I can count on her because she's proved that over and over again with some total BS, by the way. I've thrown some total BS her way over the years,
She's
and
figured it out.
she's figured it out and made it happen. Um, and so I messaged her because my thought was that, well, she's, clearly she's thinking about that on some level, and
Mhm.
that's all
Right.
I need, right?
Yeah.
That's the opening I need to get in there.
Yeah.
Um and so I messaged her and I told her my plans, and I said, if you want to do this with me, we'll 50-50 it and get this thing off the ground. um, and I don't remember if it took days or weeks, but at some point she got back to me and she was like, all right, screw it, let's do this.
Good.
And yeah, and so thus Think Tank QA was born,
Cool.
at the
And
end
so
of 2020.
tell me a little bit about Think Tank QA. So obviously name QA quality assurance, right? Um, and maybe just a little bit more details of what you do, who you work for,
Yeah,
and maybe some of the engineers that
sure.
kind of that you guys attract
Yeah,
or need.
absolutely. So Think Tank QA is a contract engineering company that we do software quality assurance consulting and contracting work. So we can essentially cover any just about any software development need from in the quality space, from consulting on building a team for somebody. So, I can come in and do what I did for Samsung. I can come in and do what I did at the nerdery, and help build processes, build metrics, uh, build the team itself, build the technical infrastructure of the team, build a quality strategy for a company. And then if they want, I can stick around and I can staff it for them. I can do the interviews. I can do the hiring. I can
Wow.
give them a completely functional internal QA team that is employed by them, and then at some point hand them the keys and walk away.
Okay.
um, that we can do that, and all the way through all automation services. We can build frameworks. We can integrate with CI/CD plans. We can do manual testing, black box testing. all the way through our simplest offering, which would be a simple contract offering where a group of engineers has a series of tests that they've already defined and need run, and they just need a body to do it. And we can put contract teams in to do that. So really, everything in the space is covered, and that's because you mentioned the kind of engineers we recruit. That's because of the kind of engineers we recruit. So right now, Think Tank QA has three partners: myself, Joy Young Turner, who she's the person I spoke about a few minutes ago, and then Steve Hanneman. And Steve he really brought a lot of strength to the table for us, because Joy and I are not engineering forward. We're at least not in that way, not in the sense of a coder, in a dark room cranking away, right? That's not been us. I'm
Your people.
personnel.
Yeah.
I'm people in business. Joy is manual testing and really operations. And we needed somebody to stand up a automation vertical, and somebody who could do it credibly. And luckily Steve came along, and we had worked together at Samsung, and he got wind of what we were doing and said, tell me a little bit more. And so we talked about it for about a month. And at the end of the day, he said, I think I'd like to be part of this. And so we brought him in as a full third partner. Um, and Steve has been doing test automation in Silicon Valley since Netscape. Like
Wow.
his first big job in Silicon Valley that I'm aware of was Netscape when it was at its peak. um, and he's been there ever since, and he's worked for everybody you've ever heard of. I mean, he's done, he's done web automation, mobile automation, back end automation. He's what's called an SDET, a software development engineer in test. And which means he's a fully skilled and capable developer who focuses his expertise on testing as opposed to developing.
Okay. Okay.
um, and to have somebody of his caliber and tenure on board to stand up our automation vertical was incredible. It was an incredible opportunity we couldn't pass up. And so we brought Steve on. And so now we've got the three partners, and the contractors that we've recruited are always, also likewise tenured. These are people I worked with at the Nerdery. They're people maybe I met at Activision who have grown their own career. They're people who are referred by that network. They're people who are really the cream of the crop of the industry. They can lead projects. They can lead really complex test structures. They can develop frameworks that are really extensible to just about any kind of testing. They're on the cutting edge of their trade. And they love it, and they're lifers. A lot of times QA is a stepstone. It's a place that people start in order to move on to a development career, or move on to a project management career. These are all people who are committed QA lifers. It is what they do. It's what they want to do. They're very good at it, and they live and breathe it. And they've worked on some of the biggest projects that that exist. We're talking about people who have single-handedly managed, uh, uh, massive migration projects for 65 million active users. I mean,
Wow.
these are
That's
these, yeah, they are the best in the business. Uh, and you know, uh, much gratitude, they want to work with us, because
great.
they know we understand QA. They know that our business is 100% focused on QA. We don't do software development. We don't do project management. We don't do UX. We don't, it's everything in the quality space. Uh, Accessibility, quality assurance, all of those things are wrapped up in what we do, and we focus on that because that's what we know and that's what we're good at, and that's what we can stand up in front of any room and talk about at length, and with confidence, and say that, this is the thing we can deliver for you. That other stuff, we could build verticals that handle all those other things, and we'd make a lot more money if we did, but we we can't with confidence stand up and say we're the best in the business at that,
Okay.
because we're not.
Cool.
We're the best in the business at this.
What you do, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and 10, 11 or so years, you go from leaving cars for junkers or whatever it
Yeah,
was
yeah,
to
yeah,
$9 an hour. Now you're a business owner, and you have this special suite with some of the top engineers in the world, and some of the things that I really like was some of the conversations that we've had, that you are excited about also giving back, that you feel very
yep,
blessed. Some of the things that you said and that I was writing down was, I networked myself into a career,
hmm,
or this person, the person at Activision made a call for me to the nerdery.
yep,
And then there was a little element of luck with the person that interviewed you at the nerdery who needed your skill set
yep,
to do this. So, and I feel like in talking to you, you feel very blessed,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
that everything kind of worked out the way that it has. And so, am I right in saying that if somebody maybe had a question about your journey, or wanted to know more about how to get into it, or whatever it might be,
Absolutely.
that you might give them 50, 30 minutes of your time if they reached out to
Absolutely.
you?
I'm so hungry to pay it forward. That's, one of the things, um, uh, like I alluded to earlier, I didn't come from money. I didn't have a situation where I was exposed to, this industry, or even how to move in these kind of worlds. Uh, I'm one generation removed from literal dirt farmers. People who are picking rocks and trying to grow enough hay to feed their horses, right?
Yeah.
So, uh, so I did not have I wasn't born with the skills and the expectation that this would be the life for me. Um, and there are having said that, and touching on the privilege piece, even with all of that, I very narrowly landed in this lane. you know Even with
Mhm.
all that working for me, I very narrowly landed in this lane. There are a lot of people out there, many of whom I know personally, who um it, would want to do something like this and would bring a lot of value to the table in an operation like this, but have simply never been exposed to the on ramp. They
Okay.
just don't they
Yeah.
just don't know it exists. And it seems like I mentioned earlier, it seems like a dream, like being a rock star and an NFL player. Like, it's just
Mhm.
one of those unattainable goals that's fun to think about, but it's not for me.
Absolutely.
But it really is for you. it really
Yes. Yeah.
it really can be.
Everybody.
Like anything, everything is not for everybody, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'd be terrible at your job. I'd be
Yeah.
even if you
You
got me
might
into
not.
it, even if you got me into it, I'd be terrible at it. I know it. I'd be terrible as an NFL quarterback. I'd be really awful, right? Like, not everything is for everybody, but
Right. Right.
you can't find that out unless you get exposed to it, right?
Get on the on ramp. So
You get on the
yeah.
on ramp. And so
Yeah.
that's what I want to share. I want to be able to show people where the on ramp is and help them understand what it takes to get there. And in that process, there's a lot of self discovery they need to go through, and there's a lot of frankly, pain that they have to endure in order to get that. And that's fine. That's good. That pain separates the wheat from the chaff, and it lets you know whether or not you're part of that, whether or not this is a good path for you. You know?
Yeah. I like the way you said it. One of the things that I talked to my wife about our children, and paths and pain and whatnot is, we want to prepare our children for the path, not the path for our children.
Bingo.
So a lot of people, maybe it's getting a little too personal, but are doing that, right? They try to make an easy path for their children, but then
Yeah.
if they go through that easy path, they may not feel the pain. They may not value that that 12-hour
Yep.
days at $9 an hour.
Yep.
And listen, and you took that as I'm not only going to work this, but while I'm sitting here doing this, I'm going to learn everything that
Yeah.
I can when I have my sensors on, and I'm going to
Yep.
be a good employee, right? The
Yeah.
thing that you said,
I'm
you bonded with your supervisor because you were
Yeah.
reliable, you were a good employee,
Yep.
you showed up on time.
Yep.
Those are things that anybody can value at any stage of their career.
It's about
Um,
investment. It's
yep.
it's about investment. It's If you don't have capital to invest in something, then you have time. You need to invest the time, and you need to pay the price to invest that time.
Mhm.
And like I say, I had the luxury of being a little older and being married, so that wasn't uh that wasn't inconceivable. There are a lot of people for whom it is inconceivable. Um, and that isn't a barrier if you have somebody who can show you, show you
How to
where
do
the
it.
on-ramp is, right? If they can show you how to sort of guide yourself through it and get to that point, um, it's still achievable.
Yeah,
God, you need that mentorship. You really need somebody
expedite that
who,
process.
yeah, yeah, you
Cool.
really need somebody who can
Well,
wake you up to it.
cool. Well, hey, thank you so much again. I appreciate the time. Anybody, feel free to reach out to me or Elliot directly. I'll tag him just so you have his information kind of LinkedIn. Again, just from knowing you, I know that you mean everything that you say, that you're excited to as you say, pay it forward. I look forward to, learning more what you're doing and continuing to grow with you, man. So I appreciate the time and appreciate who you are, and just so proud of you and everything that you've done. So
Well, I
thank you
appreciate the
again so
chance to
much.
talk about it. So thanks for having me.
No problem, sir. You have a good rest of your day, okay?
You too.
Bye bye.